Thank you. Thank you very much, Catherine. I'm very pleased and honored to be with you today. And I may say that this is a heavy responsibility to talk about this difficult issue of the ethics and the progress of neuroscience. And I also want to thank Professor Schmidt for his introduction. And I don't know if I am qualified, despite all the compliments that you gave, Catherine, about myself, if I am qualified to really discuss these issues, because I am not a professional ethicist, if I may say, and that all the experience I have about ethics is just coming from the chairmanship of the French Bioethics Committee from 92 to 98. And I was asked by President François Mitterrand to chair this committee without having published anything about ethics. So I hope the ethicists who are present here will forgive me for some mistakes I'm certainly going to make during this presentation. Yet I found as a scientist the experience of chairing the French Bioethics Committee as very rewarding, as a human experience, but also, if I may say, as a philosophical experience as a scientist. And I think this is something that all of us should experience as scientists. And I may start by a slide showing that, in fact, the ethics of medicine and biomedical research is not new, because you have already the Hippocratic Oath in the 5th century before Christ. And some of the statements I am going to list are up to date about ethics and the neuroscience. Never do harm to anyone, only for the good of the patient, and the exercise of the profession I will keep secret. So these are some issues which are very present today. Just never do harm to anyone, which is already a fundamental ethics principle, and only for the good of the patient. Then you have the Nuremberg Code of 1947, which is the real basis of all the bioethics today, because the subsequent declaration and which followed were actually inspired from the Nuremberg Code. And I may say that looking back to this document is a very instructive thing, because there are aspects which are fundamental and others which have been a little bit challenged after 1947, and which may have to be discussed. First, the issue of voluntary consent is, of course, something absolutely essential in all our ethical approach to the neuroscience. And since we have to do, if I may use the word, experiments with human beings in some circumstances, and the issue of voluntary consent, we say today informed consent, is something very important, because we have to inform the subject, and sometimes it's extremely difficult to inform the subject of what is actually going on. The second aspect which was put there, which is an interesting statement which was modified subsequently, is that the experiment should be such as to yield fruitful results for the good of society. And I think this is interesting, because today we have the tendency to say for the good of the subject, of the patient. And for the good of society means that it's a broader application than simply the subject himself. And this is of course, it does not exclude the subject. It includes it within the society. And there is also another statement that deliberately put there, and which is challenged by some tendencies, which is the experiments should be designed and based on the results of animal experimentation. And I remember when I was the chairman of the French Bioethics Committee, this was a must. It was a prerequisite that any kind of experiment done in human beings be preceded by experiments with animals. It doesn't mean that one has not to take particular care of the animals, but it means that we need them. And this is something that maybe thought about more recently. And they also should be conducted in the way that they avoid all unnecessary suffering and injury. This is evident. And also an interesting aspect of it is that the subject should have the liberty to bring the experiment to an end, which is also something which has to be taken into consideration when somebody is willing to accept to be the subject of an experiment. Now, the following declarations and revisions of the Nuremberg Code were confirming most of the statements with the nuances I introduced, but also they introduced the notion of independent committee. These are the bioethics committee or commissions or whatever that you heard about. I will discuss that at the end of my presentation for the Human Being Project. But there are also other features which are of particular importance. The issue of autonomy of the subject, the issue of beneficence and non-maleficence, which is already in the Hippocratic Oath, the issue also of justice, which is a very important aspect of all our ethical reasonings, and I already mentioned the confidentiality, and last but not least, because there are many other aspects which have been introduced later on, the respect of the person. And this issue of respect for person is very critical and may have to be thought about a little bit more. And in the next slide, I show a painting that my wife and myself gave to the Museum of Meaux, which shows Jesus and Martha and Mary house. And it's an interesting painting, which has been actually produced by a topic which has been used by many painters from the classical period. And you see here Martha, who complains. Do you not care that my sister left me to do all the work by myself? Please tell her then to help me. And then, very amazingly, I am not going to discuss the ethics of the answer, which may be debatable, and just then say Mary has chosen the better part, which is for us a rather surprising statement. But in any case, if I show this, is simply because you have here interesting representation of dialogue between three persons with what is called intentional communication, with, of course, representation of the world, because Martha is complaining, so she has a representation of what's going on, but she is also having a self-recognition, because she is complaining that she has been working all the time and only by herself. So there is a self-other distinction. There is, if I may say, a search for mutual recognition and also for shared reward, because she complains that she has not the reward she was expecting from Jesus when he makes this statement. So I think it's an interesting situation where we have the way here to define what the capable person is. And we may say that a capable person is a rational and conscious individual engaged in social relationships with personal identity and social status. And I think this painting just illustrates this definition quite well. So then we may look for what we may call ethical intention, which is beyond or behind, I should say, what I'm going to discuss with you. And I may suggest, if you have not already ready, to look at Paul Ricoeur's work and also the dialogue I had with him. Him as an independent philosopher. He was from a Protestant tradition, but he always claimed that he did not want the disposition be linked to any kind of conviction. It was a secular position for himself, and myself as a neuroscientist. And I always use this definition of ethical intention that I like, because there is a tendency in the public, in the opinion, and to see ethics as restrictive norms of behaviors. You are going not to do things. Don't do that. And I think this is a way that Paul Ricoeur, if I may say myself, share, that in fact we should look at ethics in a very positive and constructive way as looking for good life. This is from the Aristotelian definition, with and for others, which give the social dimension, and in just institutions, which give you the environment where you are living and the culture in which you are embedded. So this is, for me, a way to look at ethical issue in a very positive and constructive manner for the good of people. Now, the Human Brain Project was developed in the past years as a project which was submitted to the Future and Emerging Technologies flagship program. And the title of this program, which I still preserve in the original proposal, was to stimulate massive European collaboration to understand the brain and its disease and develop new computational technologies. This is the aim of the project. And it was headed by Henry Markram, originally, from EPFL, and then joined to him Karl-Heinz Mayer from Heidelberg and Richard Frankowijk from Lausanne. So in addition to this huge European program headed by these three scientific personalities, there have been at this stage up to 87 partners in 23 countries, and it's expected that during the years, about 200 partners after 5 years would compose this human brain program. So you see all the constellation of disciplines which are gathered together in this human brain program. And I then underline the word multidisciplinary. I did not use purposely the word interdisciplinary, which to my opinion is meaningless. It's multidisciplinary in the sense that we are having a collection of experts in their discipline and who are working together to better understand the brain and develop applications from this knowledge. So there are also scientists involved in brain simulation, neuroinformatics, neuromorphic computing, and high-performance computing. There is also, of course, a section on medical application and on ethics and society. And together with Katinka Evers, who is professor of philosophy at Uppsala University, I am a co-chairman of this ethics and society section. So this is a multidisciplinary enterprise to understand the brain. Now, there is also a major, what I would call, epistemological challenge, in the sense that in these different disciplines, the brain is being approached at different levels of organization. And we have, and this is something I have always been pleading for, to take into consideration the fact that we have multiple nested levels of organization in the human brain, and that these nested levels result from evolution. So it's a nested sets of evolutionary processes from the bottom to the top, and this is something which is extremely important, from the top to the bottom. So we have a reciprocity, an interconnection and interregulation between the different levels, from the atomic to the cognitive levels. And you have, of course, here examples as far as structure is concerned, from the structure of molecules, nerve cells, networks, and as far as function, from single channels, brain recordings, brain imaging, and behavior. So this is an issue which, of course, creates major philosophical point of view, and to my opinion, any kind of approach of the brain has to deal with this. We cannot isolate one level, let's say for the molecular biologist, the molecular level to explain the brain, and for the philosopher, from the behavioral level to explain the molecular biology. So we have to deal with this interesting situation together with the multidisciplinarity I just discussed before. So I will, at the end of my presentation, deal with this issue which I call epistemological ethics, which deal with this aspect of multidisciplinarity. Now, we have thought about ethics for the good of people. And of course, we have to list what are the major burdens for brain studies. And this is, of course, the issue of brain disorders. And across 30 European countries, in a typical year, about 165 million people are going to suffer for fully developed brain illness, aging being included, of course. So it means that up to 30 or more % of the population are going to be affected by any kind of brain disease, including suffering, headaches, and things, depression, or whatever. And of course, aging, loss of memory for words, for instance, and so on. So the total cost is about 800 billion in 2010. So this is an enormous burden for the society today. And in this respect, and I give the reference, you can find the data in the references I quoted. European research on brain disease, it's much less supported than research on cancer, information technology, agriculture, other areas, and of course in physics. There is, therefore, an urgent need to discover new therapeutics for brain disease, and I think, to me, this is the first ethical responsibility we have, to find new drugs to fight against these diseases I just mentioned. And this should be done at the European and world scale. So, well, we start from the bottom and go to the top, but as I said, we can also go from the top to the bottom. And I am not going to teach you about the neuron. The fact that the neural networks are discontinuous. And I think there was a philosophical debate at the time of Ramon y Cajal, whether the network was continuous or discontinuous. And there was a big debate between him and Golgi. And Golgi was in favor of the continuous network, and Ramon y Cajal was in favor of the discontinuous network. Why? Well, because in the continuous network, the soul would be able to circulate more easily than in a discontinuous network. There was an ideological issue behind that. And we know now, sorry, for those who think the opposite, that the network is discontinuous, and that all the connections which are taking place between nerve cells are taking place at the level of synapses, which could be electrical or chemical. And in the case of chemical synapses, we have neurotransmitters, which are chemicals, which are used in the intercellular communication. And of course, it means that we have here electrical impulses which can be entirely reduced to physical phenomena. And here we have chemical mechanisms which are involved in the transfer of information from one cell to another and through the synapse. And we now know most of the neurotransmitters, like acetylcholine, like norepinephrine, peptides, and so on, of the receptors, of the effect of the neurotransmitter on the receptor, and on the conformation transition, which are linking the neurotransmitter here to the opening of the ion channel in this particular case of receptor. And I may say even that the dynamics of our brain processes, what is called the psychological times, 100 milliseconds. Well, you don't take it out of the pocket. Why 100 milliseconds? Simply because you have the speed of propagation of the nerve impulse, which is very, very slow compared to a computer, to the speed of light. It is slower than the speed of sound. Why is it that slow? You know? Well, simply because you have at the level of the ion channels of the receptors, the release of the receptor, time scale of the molecular transitions, which are in fact limiting the time scale of the processes of the whole brain. This is something which is a bottom-up kind of constraint that you cannot escape. Your brain will never work like at the speed of light. Now we can have a discussion about why. This is another story. But if you come tomorrow to my talk, I will give you an answer. This is not to make any kind of propaganda for tomorrow's talks, but there is an answer to that. So it means that here we have, if I may say, the molecular and cellular components of thought, in the sense that all what's happening in our brain goes through these building blocks. Now, the consequence is that, of course, our brain is a highly evolved physico-chemical machine, and that knowledge of the universal chemical components of the human brain, the dynamics of their allosteric transition, their alteration in brain disease, and so on and so forth, is going to help us to design drugs. And this is one of the aims of the Human Brain Program. So this is a very positive, if I may say, consequence of this, I would say, physico-chemical view of our brain. And as I illustrated here, when you look at the number of new drugs in the market during the past decade, you see that it's a catastrophe. So there is, as I said, an ethical issue there. And also there are also methods which have been developed on the basis of this organicist view of the brain, of brain stimulation, which is being used, for instance, in Parkinson's disease, and helping considerably the patients to overcome the motor difficulties they have. So these are, if I may say, positive consequences of this view of the brain. So the question then becomes, and this is an interesting philosophical issue, to what extent this neurocognitive science from the molecule to the to cognition lead to a simulation of the human brain, which would account for human behavior, starting from the building block, and I would say accounting for any kind of human behavior. Good question. We can discuss that later on. I leave you with the open question, because that's usually the case for ethics. The question is to ask the question. I may say that personally I have doubts about the achievement of such program, in the sense that the models that we are using for simulation are simply the product of the human brain, and nevertheless will have also limitations when applied to reality. And up to now, even the best physicists or mathematicians do not pretend that his model is going to give an exhaustive description of reality. Never do that. And we have to follow this rules as well. And this is one of the issues which have to be discussed. Now, what about dualism versus monism, or any kind of Spinozist or materialistic view of the brain? Well, I think we have to accept that the issue at this stage of dualism is something which does not make too much sense for the neurobiologists, and that we have to think about ourselves in these terms. And this is, of course, a difficult issue for many of us, to just abandon this Cartesian or Platonist view of the brain, and nevertheless try to think about us anyway. This is, of course, something which has also a consequence. I already discussed the good things about having this physico-chemical view of the brain, but there are some which are not as positive. Let's start to talk about what is called enhancement. And there is a philosophy from the Californian coast called transhumanism, which believes that we have to improve the quality of the human brain. They are not good enough, so we should take any kind of drug we find on the market, boost all our faculties, be a much better human being. I don't know how they view in detail these aspects, but I may say that I have a lot of doubts myself about this general view of enhancement. On the other hand, and that's where I make an ethical difference, basic one, for patients who are suffering for Alzheimer, for any kind of cognitive deficit, we need this kind of compound. We need to have drugs which enhance the faculties of the patients, which are altered by the disease. So you see here a very difficult situation, and many of the ethics committees see only the enhancement, like the transhumanists talk about, and never consider the aspect of the patients that we have to deal with and that we have to help to some extent from their disease. So this is something which is debatable again, and we have to define where the positive aspects are and where the negative aspects are. I think it's easy to see the negative effects. It's more difficult to see how to deal with the positive ones. Nevertheless, this is something we should think about. Now, we have also to realize that this action of chemicals in the brain has been used for military purposes, and the discovery of organophosphate, for instance, and the use of nerve gases, which, as you know, unfortunately is still used in some countries. Now, I'll just give you another document about a misuse of this knowledge of the brain and of its chemistry, which is from a document from 1955 called MK Ultra. You can find it on the web. It's public. I have nothing, but just to show how far the perversion of misuse of our knowledge on the chemistry of the brain can be further developed. And when you read this with documents, you cannot really believe how far it was going to promote illogical thinking, to promote ability of individuals to withstand privation, torture, and coercion during interrogation, and so-called brainwashing, to alter personality structure, lower the ambition, which is not good for the students, but this was designed against chief of states, and so on, and also called the victim to age faster, and cause, of course, permanent brain damage. I already mentioned that, and so on and so forth. So this is really something that we have to keep in mind. In addition, you may see that these experiments were done on mental patients, prisoners, drug addicts, and prostitutes, so that they were people who could not fight back. So this is a dramatic case, which, of course, is no longer being developed, at least in the United States, and I hope so, but in other countries, this is something which we have to be concerned with ourselves as neuroscientists and also as human beings, of course. So this is for the view of the brain as a physico-chemical machine. So there are positive aspects, many important positive aspects, but also very negative ones. And this is always the case when we have to think about ethics and science. And the question is then how to, I would say, favor the positive against the negative. And we are going to another topic, which is the relationship between our knowledge of the human genome and the organization of the brain. Now, there are a lot of data about the mutation of occurring in humans and mental disease, and also models in the mouse, where you try to link mutation in the mouse to models of human brain disease. And I think the very interesting paradox which you find illustrated here is that going from the mouse to the human brain, you find that the number of neurons is ranging from 40 million to 70 billions. And the number of genes don't change. And I will always remember Craig Venter presenting from the first time the data on the mouse genome and saying, well, we find that the human genome and the mouse genome are very similar. So I asked him, are you happy with that? I said, yes, of course. Well, I say, for me, it's a real puzzle. But of course, as a neuroscientist, it's an issue which looks like a paradox. And how to deal with this? Well, I am not going to give you the solution of all the answer. I could give a seminar, but this is not the issue. It's here we have to deal with ethics. And you can see here what is the last view about the relationship with de novo mutations and autistic behavior, and in particular the Asperger syndrome, ASD. And this is from Thomas Bourgeron from the Pasteur Institute, from our department, who has been pioneering the identification of the genes which predispose to autism. And you can see this beautiful plot, and there are at least 200 predisposition genes. So we are quite far from the scheme which is present in many people's mind, because there is, of course, the few examples of monogenic dominant kind of mutations, that the relationship between gene and behavior, or between gene and brain anatomy and brain functions is not simple at all. That's for sure. And when you say, oh, this is an innate disposition of the human brain, so I always say, so please, can you explain to me how the innate mechanism is working, accounting for what I said before? So it means that we have to invent models of gene expression, which are necessary. And if you are interested, there is, among many other debates, I just put some quotation of proposal that we think that it's no longer one gene, one function that is our key, but that we have to deal with gene assemblies like neuronal assemblies, but of course at the gene level, and that we have to think about the development of the brain in those terms. So this is, of course, a view which is based on science. Once again, when we are talking about ethics, we should start from science and then see how we can deal with it through ethics. And it means that there are indeed innate disposition of the human brain, which we think are universal, and which have several characteristics, like the distinction made by the newborn between living and inanimate objects, the cognition of human faces, predisposition to language. Already, as you can see here, the newborn can distinguish here using brain imaging forward and backward speech. Conscious access, empathy, and sympathy are already, if I may say, universal features of the human brain which are already present in the newborn. So the general ethical issues that we are facing with is that we have not only, I would say, universal innate disposition, I just illustrated here, but also aspects with the variability of human genome data, which add up on what I call the paradox of the relationship between a small number of genes and a very complex brain organization, and nevertheless have this universality of human behavior. And this is, for me, very important aspects to keep in mind. Because if we want to have universal ethical rules, like a Declaration of Human Rights on even human duties, then our brain, all over the world, as human beings, have to deal with these rules. So if we don't have, if I may say, a universality of human brain disposition which are involved in ethical reasoning or ethical debates, then it will be a difficulty and a problem. Now, as I said, there is a variability, and this may, of course, be useful for the diagnostic and the efficacy of brain therapeutics, plus the issue of the management of this information about genetics and brain disease, and of course the again and again this issue of genetic enhancement of the human brain, which, to my opinion, under the present condition, is not acceptable in terms of use, except if it is for local aspects, like for the eye, the retina, or some highly localized alterations of human brain functions. Now, I am shifting to a third level of organization from the chemistry, the molecular biology, and the postnatal development of the human brain, and the issue that there is a strong impact on the environment on the development of the human brain. And the variability is not only due to the genetics, but also to the epigenesis by synapse selection, which is taking place during development. And here we are dealing with something which is unique in the case of the human brain, because it takes, as you know, 15 years to get an adult brain. And during all this evolution, there are processes of imprinting, synapse selection, elimination, which are nested together. And for us, the ethical consequences of this scientific observation are of major importance. So it means that we have here a mechanism for the production of culture, but also a mechanism for the internalization of culture in the developing human being. So this is something which is very important to understand the cultural differences which exist between human beings, and also the will sometimes of authorities, powers, to change the cultural impregnation of the human brain, which took place during early development. And you know from early Desjardins work that, in fact, in the organization of our brain, there are what I may call cultural circuits which are built within our brain. Now you may say, but you talk about genetics. Yes, but on top of genetics, there is this cultural variability. And the best proof for that, to my opinion, is this discovery by the Desjardins of lesions which in the human brain cause some disease, which is, for instance, here, the loss of reading, which, or writing, language, written language, which is something which has been invented by human beings, let's say 8,000 years ago. So it means that we are here facing a cultural invention, that our brain was not genetically predetermined to match reading and writing. It happened that the disposition of the human brain are such that it accepts this kind of cultural impregnation. And as you can see here, the fact that you learn to read and write change the organization of the human brain to a large extent. This was initially found by this group of Portuguese scientists together with Ingvar, who is Swedish, and these are the experiments by Stanislas Dehaene recently, which shows that also one can have, even in the adult human brain, this kind of remodeling of the connectivity which is taking place. So it means that we have a postnatal construction of the human brain, which not only deal with the constraints of the genetics, as I said before, but in addition, which incorporate the interaction with the environment in the development. And there are cultural imprints in our brain, and which are, of course, of importance to understand, if I may say, the capable person I introduced at the beginning of my talk as an individual with personal identity and social status, taking into consideration that a subject which lives in a particular social and cultural environment, becoming impregnated by this environment, and has, in addition, its own personal history. So the personal history of the individual, of what makes each of us a unique person, is due to these genetic, epigenetic factors and individual history that and social status that we lived with in the past. So this is, of course, an issue which is of extreme importance in the sense, and we start by the end of this slide, but which for me is a very important issue, is that we may have, in fact, human proper disposition which are innate, which may be universal. I try to emphasize that. But we may also have dispositions which are acquired from our environment and which introduce the issue of relativism of human cultural representations, because they are acquired and produced by human brains. And this include, of course, spoken and written language. I just talked about that. But also social rules, symbolic systems, philosophical, and religions, which is always an issue which create debate. So this view, in fact, introduce the issue of cultural relativism. Now there might be some rules in culture. Lévi-Strauss and others have debated about that. We have to further discuss this, but this is, I think, an important ethical issue about any kind of debates we may have in an ethical committee. I experienced it. We have people who are of goodwill, from different origin, from different convictions, from different training, doctors, mathematicians, lawyers, ecclesiastics, and so on. And we have to go together and deal with a common kind of ethical rules or ethical recommendations after the debate. And I think we are in a position where I think we can do that, because our brain has the disposition to do it, accounting from just what I said. So this is, I think, an issue of of importance. The other one is what I call the equality of chance. I noted in my first slide the issue of equality. And this is something which, of course, is an immense importance when people are speaking about enhancement by chemicals and so on to improve the human brain. My first reaction is that, well, look at all these people who are not following a correct and adequate education. So this is the first thing to think about, is to give an equal access to education to all human beings on this planet. So this is an immediate consequence of this kind of reasoning that we can develop from these scientific observations that I just illustrated before. So last but not least, of course, you may say, you have not approached consciousness and self-consciousness. Well, I don't want to say that we have the answer yes at this stage. Certainly not. But I just want to say that there are approaches which are being developed. And this is one that Stanislas Dehaene and myself have developed. Him with more the experimental psychology experience, and myself with the anatomical and biochemical experience, to join together and develop this scheme. The idea being that we need some space in our brain where we have a multimodal kind of representation of the world. You are now, I hope, several of you still in a waking state, not too many sleeping. Maybe if I am too slow and too late, it will happen. But and then you have your eyes open, your ears are open as well. So you integrate visual, auditory, even physical gravity perception stimuli, together with the long-term memory that you have in your brain, and you put all these things together in one space, even if you have 2 eyes and 2 ears. So where does it take place? Good question. So the very simple-minded model that we have used, which was based on my teaching at the Collège de France, where I had the opportunity to go back to Desjardins and to von Economo and others, is that there are in the brain long-range connections which originate from pyramidal cells from layer 2 and 3, and that they may interconnect with each other so that they can link different regions of our brain and put all these things together, all the information from these different areas to these areas. So it's a reciprocal kind of interaction, and this is the hypothesis we discussed. This is not a course of neuroscience, so I will be very brief. Those who are interested can look at a paper that we wrote together, Stanislas and myself, in 2011 in Neuron. So this is the global neuronal workspace hypothesis in short. Now, just want to say that there are some neuronal experiments or neuronal bases to support this hypothesis. I don't want to say demonstrate, but at least in agreement or consistent with. Here, for instance, an experiment where you present to the subject these kind of slides and the word lion. And here, the difference is the word note is between 2 slides with pictures called mask. And these are the time scale. And you ask the subject, have you seen something? And he said, yes, lion. And then you ask the subject, have you seen something? No. So there is a subjective reading of a word in one case and not in the other. And when you look at the brain image, and this has been confirmed with different modalities, you find that something which resembles the global neuronal workspace, which is, as I illustrated before, a network which link the prefrontal cortex, the parieto-temporal, and cingulate cortex, using this long-range connection, as I said, then you can see that indeed you find that there is much more activity there than in the case of non-conscious processing, which also can be assessed, since after the experiment you may ask the subject to select a name in a list, and he is going to select the name it was exposed to before. So just the last slide about this aspect is that together with Claire Sergent, we have been able to build up a very simple-minded model for this conscious and unconscious processing. Again, I have not the time to discuss that here. But it's interesting that if, for instance, here you are looking for a masking experiment between two visual stimuli, one being the mask and the other, you can, in fact, be in a situation where you are blinking or masking stimulus when you shorten the time distance between the two stimuli. And just to say that one can start to model conscious versus non-conscious processing, if I may say, from molecule to mind. So this means that we can approach, I would say, conscious processing, not only through neuronal observation, but through simulation. And this slide just shows that this is also the case for self, since there are any case of alteration of the self through drugs, for instance, or through different lesions in the cerebral cortex. And without going the entire list, it simply illustrates that there is a neuroscience of the cells going on. So, consequences. I go back to the issue of the capable person I just discussed before. Now, well, I think there is perhaps a way to approach. I don't want to fully understand. That's not my point. My point is to say that we may bring, as neuroscientists, some useful information to better understand what a capable person is. It's an additional way to understand what we are as hopefully capable persons. And of course, we have also a way to approach some mental diseases. And of course, we are dealing here with a lot of ethical issues, and which you are all familiar with. And I emphasized at the beginning of my presentation the issue of autonomy and the issue of privacy. Remember, this was in my first slide. And of course, this is a question which is now being challenged by the development of the neuroscience. And we have a way to have access to subjectivity. It's opening the possibility of mind reading. I don't want to say this. We are fully reading what's happening in the human brain at a given stage. It's not yet the stage, but there are steps on this direction which are being taking place. Also, of course, after the list of chemicals which may alter personality and so on and so forth, we are being faced by the issue of influencing human decisions on the basis of our knowledge of brain function and organization. Of course, the issue of irreversibly alter human behaviors is an important issue. And of course, we are now approaching the question of the neuroscience of informed consent. This may be a paradox for all of us being concerned by the issue of informed consent in ethical debates, but this is something that we have to deal with. Now, I am going very quickly now on the new technologies for human society, the development of new computers, of robotics, of high-performance computing, and so on so fast. The situation where, sooner or later, the human brain is going to be challenged by the computer at some stage. And who is going to take the decision at the nation scale, at the world scale, in markets, in political decisions, and so on and so forth? Is it going to be the computer or the brain of the politician? Or both of them, but one being influenced by the other? So this is, if I may say, a real ethical challenge for the future. And we have to be aware of all that. Now, I may close this part, and I have only a few things more to say of my presentation about the general ethical issue raised by this technological development. The most important one being, of course, how are we going to behave with all these machines around us which are performing better than us? We are in a situation where should we have some ethics vis-à-vis the robots that we have built? Or should they have some ethical behavior as far as we are concerned? Should they respect us? I think this is I'm just raising a question, which is not a far-fetched question. Because already we are facing the invasion of the privacy of our children by electronic machines. They are now in a stage where they are going to forget about handwriting, but they will type only. And they will learn a lot of features from their computers that human beings did not learn before. And fortunately, our brain is such that thanks to this epigenesis I just mentioned before, we may have children who acquired a lot of performance that us as adults are unable to do. So this is something that we have to deal with in the future. And in a general manner, there are, of course, important consequences as far as the society is concerned from the discoveries in the human brain programs, I put in general, impact on economy, of course, on politics, I already mentioned that, and the main and more important one is, are we able to protect ourselves against the utilization of these data, not for the good of human beings, but for the destruction of human beings? And this is something that is a very serious political question. And the tendency would be to, oh, let's forbid all these things. But if we forbid this scientific research, we are also forbidding what is important for the survival and the good of the human beings. So we have to get clever politicians who are able to distinguish between the two. And of course, we have consequences on legal systems. Because, for instance, the most important one is in front of of a judge was the subject responsible for its acts. It's a neuroscientific issue. And of course, now there are people coming to the tribunal with, oh, this is my my scan, my brain scan, and you can see that I have that, and therefore you should not condemn me for this crime, so on and so forth. So you can see immediately that there are important legal issues which are linked with the development of brain imaging, in addition to what I illustrated before. So the conclusion of that is that we have, as scientists, to be responsible. And this is the way we started in SP12 of the Human Brain Program. And we have to address the issues raised by the research on the neuroscience and these informatics and so on. The social, ethical, and philosophical implications, to address them in an open and transparent manner. This is what I tried to do with you. And also to provide the scientists with opportunities to not only understand the consequences of their work, their ethical responsibility as scientists, and also to understand the public reaction to their work. And it's easy to say, well, the cultural diversity is associated with a different brain reorganization due to the cultural imprinting. Of course, this is something which you may see as some kind of beginning of, I don't want to say an explanation, but an insight on the cultural difference. But then when you have done that, how are you going to deal with it? And this is something that we have to think about, and in particular about education. Should we have a universal, secular education? It's a good question. My answer is yes, but maybe it's not a universal way of looking at education. Well, this is the French tradition, if I may say, but well, why not? So this is just to say that we have been very much concerned by the issue in HBP, and there is a budget for that. And there is an ethics section. You have here the list of the consortium people. And I want to just close on some of the goals. And of course, we have the issue of conceptual and philosophical concern I just mentioned about. We have the public dialogue and engagement, which is also important in the communication with the public. But we have also a very original structure, which is the Foresight Laboratory, which has been started by Nicholas Rose in England, and where we try to have an objective way of trying to evaluate the industrial, economic, and social consequences of the Human Brain Program to, of course, the benefit of the humankind. This is, of course, always difficult to anticipate what's going to happen, but at least there is an attempt to look at it. Doesn't mean that they are going to be right, but they may point some obvious things that we may not think about by ourselves. So I think it's a very interesting enterprise and a rather original one. And we have also another section which is interested in what we call the researcher awareness, which is to encourage and foster ethical and societal reflection and debate within and between the scientists which are part of HPP. So this is something which we hope is going to be successful. I don't know. perhaps it's the most difficult part of the whole program, but we have to get those doing the work be aware of what is their ethical responsibility for the good of the humankind. So this is an interesting and rather original section of the goals of SP12. Now, of course, we have committees, an ethical, legal, and social aspect committee, which is a consultative committee to produce opinions and report on the prominent ethical and philosophical issue raised by HPP, and a research ethics committee about the applications and experiments being done within HPP. And there is also the issue of animal use. I just mentioned that at the beginning, and so on and so forth. So this is just an overview of the composition of these committees to see and illustrate the diversity of disciplines. And this is the ethical, legal, and social aspect committee, and the research ethics committee, where you have very distinguished scientists working there. So we plan to integrate all this information, and this is just an example of integration. Now I will close on one point for 2 minutes more. Sorry for being a little bit beyond my time. But I think it's a very important issue. I want to close on that, which is, I would say, what I call the epistemological ethics, which is based on an extremely important notion that which is obvious for most of us, but which has to be said, is that there is a unity of knowledge in the multidisciplinary enterprise, which is the human brain program. That what is true in physics should be true in biology, should be true in the social sciences, should be true in ethics as well. So there is a whole unity of knowledge, and we have to accept the issue of Kant, who developed this thesis, of not only a unity of knowledge, but of consciousness and objective reason, which is a condition of knowledge acquisition, which is something which for many of us is trivial, evident, but has to be expressed and formulated. Now, this introduces some condition in the work which is going to be done in HPP, but also in this university, if I may say, which we have to understand the discipline of the other. You know, we have, as biologists, to understand what the physicists are trying to do. We may not achieve the full understanding, but we have to approach them and try to understand what they are doing. And this is important in the framework of a positive cooperation between disciplines in a multidisciplinary approach. And this goes with what I would say a fair sharing of knowledge and trust between distinct disciplines, which is something that we need to develop. And last but not least, there is, of course, some kind of freedom of the pen. I'm again quoting Kant, which means that we have within such a multidisciplinary enterprise the need to have a flexibility in the theoretical program, in the application, some kind of liveliness of the whole program so that it can operate as an evolutionary kind of system, which is going to work by trial and error within this network of disciplines and clusters with what Canguilhem called emerging knots of rationalities, which are going to appear during this cultural evolution. So what does it mean? It means that not a single man should have the responsibility to take decisions. The decisions should be collegial. And this is sometimes very difficult to achieve because we are not used to it. In the French, like in the German system, there is the boss, then there is a sub-boss, then there is the so on. So we have to think about it and adopt some kind of way to take decisions, which is not the usual way, to assess the freedom of scientific development together with cooperation in a multidisciplinary enterprise. Now, the last slide is the work that I have been doing with a philosopher. So this is a collaboration between a philosopher and a neuroscientist. This is maybe something paradoxical, but it happens from time to time. And the idea is that simply using this epigenesis theory I just mentioned before, we have some flexibility in our brain so that we can be proactive and just have access to new representation of the world, which is in front of us, to have access to eventually new normative aspects of the work we are doing with, and therefore adapt our social structure in both the short and long term to benefit, influence, and constructively interact with the ever-developing neuronal architecture of our brain. Thank you very much.